as long as I've really been aware of the world at large. You know, you get to be that point when you're a kid where all of a sudden there's things that are a little more than just your immediate horizons, and you start to read a little bit, and you start to understand a little bit more. And one of those things that I've noticed since then, it's been about 40 years or so now, I guess, since I would say I really started to listen to this, but people would check the statistics, they would write articles about which occupations were the most needed at that time. And I've sort of watched things shift over those 40 years or so. For a while there, it seemed like they were talking about needing people to go into engineering. And then at times they've talked about medicine. Or for a while, about the time I was in college, they were talking about people needed to be in business and finance and all that. We saw where that led us. And then high tech has been the most recent thing. But I have never, I've got to say this, I've never in all my years read where anyone who studied the matter said that what the world needs is more shepherds. Have you seen anything different than that? You know, there's just not that much demand anymore for wool or mutton, is there? So when we read, as we will in John chapter 10 this morning, that Jesus declared, "I am the good shepherd," we might be tempted to think, well, whoop-de-doo, Jesus. It's not like you have a lot of competition. But if we'll get beyond our bias toward modern ways of life, if we'll listen just a little while to the ancient metaphors of the Bible, we're going to find that what seems to be outdated and irrelevant to our day speaks directly to the deepest needs of our hearts. You might not recognize it, my friend, but we need a shepherd. Every single one of us needs one to guide and protect. And we don't need just some hired hand. We need the best shepherd of all. We need Jesus. Before we look at the Bible this morning, we're going to be in the 10th chapter of John, but let me sort of set the stage for what we're about to read. Let me set it in context, okay? Last week we examined the second of Jesus' great declarations about himself, what we call the I am statements. There's 7 of them in the Gospel of John. And last week we saw the one that says, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." And then we touched on one of the mighty miracles of Jesus that's recorded in the 9th chapter of the Gospel of John. The healing of a man who had been born blind. Jesus himself tied what he did to what he had earlier said about himself, declaring, "While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." And he opened that man's eyes physically as a sign of what he was teaching spiritually. That man received his sight. He could see the light as evidence of what we need to happen in our lives. That fellow's healing created quite an uproar. It was right there in the big middle of a bunch of people. It was during the Feast of Tabernacles there in Jerusalem, and the spiritual leaders, the so-called spiritual leaders, I guess maybe we'd be better calling them religious leaders, they got in an uproar about it. They had all sorts of objections to what Jesus had done. First of all, he had done it on the wrong day. He had done it on a Sabbath, the day that no one was supposed to do any kind of work. And if healing is anything, surely it's work. They didn't like that. And they hadn't officially authorized Jesus. And in fact, for the first while, they didn't know it was Jesus. The fellow said, "I don't know who that man was. He just told me to go wash in the pool of Siloam and I was going to see." After a big bunch of rigmarole, you can read the whole chapter for yourself, Jesus found that fellow again. And it tells us in verse 35 that he asked the man, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" And the fellow not only believed, it says in verse 38, that he worshiped him. He worshiped him. He trusted that he was the Son of Man, the promised one that was to come. And some of those religious experts witnessed that conversation, the two of them talking. And they sought to take Jesus down a notch or two. And it was to those people Jesus told this story in the first few verses of John chapter 10. Let's read it. Very truly, I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. The setting of this story was the average village in the hill country of Israel. The various families who lived there had a few sheep each, mainly for the wool they would supply. There were very few people that actually ate the mutton because you didn't want to kill the goose that laid the golden wool. So what they would do, though, instead of each family devoting a member to take out their 3 or 4 sheep and graze them and be out there night and day, they would combine forces, and that together they would hire one person to be a shepherd. And these little communities, they would have their little houses, and then around to the house, the side of the house, they would have a little courtyard with a wall. And this shepherd would start at one end of town, and he would sort of walk through singing, whistling, whatever he decided to do, whatever his characteristic sort of thing was, and the people would hear him coming. And so they knew it was their shepherd. They would go, they would open the gate to their courtyard, and their sheep had heard him coming too. And they were thinking, green grass is ahead. And so they would scamper out and get behind the shepherd, and he would go from one end of the little community to the other, singing and calling. The people would open their courtyards, the sheep would file out, and they would follow him up into the hills. They would go to graze. They would go and find fresh water. And so it's an interesting sort of picture that he describes here. These would go. And to this story, Jesus adds this interesting information about thieves and robbers, that the families would never open the doors of their courtyards to them. If they're going to get in, if they're going to do anything, they got to climb over the wall. And a stranger, he said, they could never coax those sheep to come out and follow them because they know their shepherd's voice. It tells us in verse 6, the Pharisees didn't get it. He was talking to them about the difference between them as religious leaders and him as God's promised one, the Messiah. The difference between people who were hungry for truth and hungry for a relationship with God, that somehow all of the rules and the regulations and rituals that the Pharisees were always talking about, it just didn't ring in their hearts and they wouldn't respond. But then here comes Jesus, and he's outside of all of the normal ways of doing things, and he's talking about a father who loves people, and a sower that casts seed, and that seed finds lodging in their hearts. And you know what? It found lodging in their hearts. And so they're responding to him. And so then Jesus explained, because they didn't understand, more clearly in the following verses what he was saying. Look at verse 7. Therefore Jesus said again, Verily, very truly I say to you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. With these words, Jesus continues the journey of the shepherd with the sheep following up into the hills where they're going to graze. They're going to stay up there for several days at a time. The shepherd leading their sheep in turn to pasture, to water, and to secure rest. If you're thinking 23rd Psalm about right now, then you're doing exactly what Jesus was hoping you would do. Think about the first few verses of that psalm for a moment. Let's read them together. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. This was something that's all through the Old Testament. The shepherd who provides for his people. Now, you think about the shepherd, the physical one who would have the flock of sheep. He had very few weapons at his disposal. David had a sling. The 23rd Psalm mentions the rod and the staff, which was a stick that would have sort of a ball end on it or an end up there with maybe some nail type of things through it, where if it came down to it, he could knock the head of that wolf or whatever on the head and drive it away and make it let go of a sheep that it was trying to grasp and to kill. He had very few weapons, but part of his duty, if he's going to go out there with those sheep day and night, was that he had to provide for their protection. And so what they had devised was here and there, up there in the hill country, there were loose rocks all over the place. If you've ever been up around Fredericksburg, you would get the idea. Rocks all over the place. And so they would collect rocks and they would build a enclosure, probably circular, but it would be high enough that none of the predators of their area could get over. And it would not have a gate. You couldn't just go down to Ace Hardware and buy hardware to build a gate back then. So what they would do was these shepherds, one of the shepherds, they would herd or lead their sheep into the enclosure along about dark, and then one of the shepherds himself would settle in the gateway, and that's where he would spend the night. The only way in or out of the enclosure was over him. And it was totally going to be up to him and his willingness to stand and fight that was going to determine whether those sheep were safe through the night. Quickly, Jesus declares twice, I am the gate of the sheep. I am the gate. Again, he says a couple verses later. And then there's that glorious promise of his provision of life for all of eternity. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. Well, if he's the gate, and they know exactly what Jesus is talking about, they know that he has already said, without saying so, what he does say outright next. I'm a shepherd. But he doesn't just say, I'm a shepherd. He says, I'm the what? Good shepherd. I'm the good shepherd. In verse 11, and then again in verse 14, he declares in a way that would have set off all of their Messiah alert bells. Ding, 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 ding. He's saying something about himself here. I am the one. I am the promised Messiah. All through the Old Testament Scripture, you find them saying that Messiah would come as a shepherd. Let's look at just one of them from Ezekiel chapter 34. Verses 22 through 24. I will save my flock, and they will no longer be plundered. I will judge between one sheep and another. I will place over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he will tend them. He will tend them and be their shepherd. I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David will be prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken. I'm going to send a shepherd. He's going to be David. He's going to fulfill that promise. And so Jesus is saying, I'm the good shepherd. I didn't come to enrich my own life like Pharisees, like you have. I've come to lay down my life for my sheep. Hired hands would cut and run. That's what he's talking about here, but not him. No way, no how. He can be trusted. He says, I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. They recognize my voice. It would be enough to think that we would be able to recognize Jesus as our shepherd, just like a sheep recognizing the voice of their shepherd, and they follow along with him. But he kicks it up a notch from there. He says in verse 15 that we can come to know him just as the Father knows me and I know the Father. In other words, the metaphor here, the picture of sheep and shepherd, it might illustrate the relationship that Jesus wants us to have with him, but it doesn't fully describe it. We can grow to know him more than just going, grass, water. That's where he's taking me. We can fellowship with him. We are called to join God's flock, to be Jesus' sheep, but we're blessed to be so much more than just mere livestock. We can also be his friends. And lest we think that this shepherd love is only for us, there's one other thing he says here in the passage. We are reminded, as were all those that were listening to Jesus that day, that he has other sheep in other places. For them, he was getting them ready. Even his own disciples needed to hear this because they really had a lot of trouble with this in the book of Acts, the idea that God would actually save those nasty, disgusting Gentiles. I have other people, other flocks, other sheep I'm going to go and get, but I'm not just going to have you here and them there. What does he say? I'm going to have one flock under one shepherd. All together. All together. We've been drawing some takeaways from each of these I am statements. And so I have three things I want to leave with you this morning. And the first one is this. Jesus is calling. And the ones he is calling are sheep. Sheep, not goats. Those are the contrasts that the Bible just keeps on drawing over and over again. You know, I often preach on the 23rd Psalm at funerals. I'm often requested. I ask, what's a favorite passage? And frankly, a lot of people, they'll say something along the lines, well, Mom always loved that. What's that? That the Lord is my shepherd. You know, they don't have much more remembrance maybe of the Bible even than that. And so I go, there's a point that we can do something with. And so I'll preach a funeral sermon on the 23rd Psalm. And I will say to them something like this: what a blessing it is to be able to say, the Lord is my shepherd. But let me tell you, if you're going to call the Lord your shepherd, you're saying something else about yourself. You're saying, I'm a sheep. And the best that I've come to learn about a sheep is that they are smelly, and they're stupid, and they're defenseless. I'm saying I'm a smelly, stupid, defenseless sheep. I'm needy. I'm vulnerable. I'm prone to wander away from what is best. Add to that Jesus' warnings here that there are counterfeit shepherds around. Thieves who come only to steal and kill and destroy. And we describe today's world to a T, don't we? People that are looking to get people, others on their side, to send them their money, to do this, to do that. And whether they're after our money or they're after our soul, like the devil himself, there are all sorts of forces that are out there looking to fleece us, to ensnare us, or to destroy us. Jesus is calling. He's calling his sheep. And his call sounds something sort of like this from Matthew chapter 11. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Jesus is calling his sheep. Here's something else we need to take away from what he says to us today. And that is that, believe it or not, the most rewarding life in all the world is the one that Jesus guides and guards and redeems. The best life in all the world is not to go to the most exotic places. It's not to experience the most thrilling things. It's the life that trusts in Jesus and does his will, walks in his ways as his word and his spirit demonstrates it, teaches it to us. It is what he calls life to the full. And it is through this life and on into eternity the life that Jesus saves. Third takeaway is to look at the last two verses of this passage. Well, how can you say it's true, Jay? How do you know? Well, Jesus told us how we would know. At that point, he still hadn't proved it. But then, a little later, he did. Verses 17 and 18, it says, the reason the Father loves me is that I lay down my life only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. What's the proof? Jesus died. Jesus rose again. The grave is empty. He's ascended. His disciples that were filled with fear, their hearts were transformed. They didn't care. They were no longer hirelings. They had the passion of the shepherd themselves. And they laid down their lives to tell people about it. Jesus laid down his life. He took it up again. Our shepherd laid down his life for you. his sheep. If you'll hear the call, if you'll say yes to him.